I had just turned 24 when this happened, and honestly I still think about that night every time I see a road cutting through the desert. At the time I was living in Phoenix, Arizona, and I had gone with my friend Derek to a music festival near the Nevada border. We weren't exactly super adventurous guys, just two friends trying to enjoy a weekend before going back to our normal work routines. I worked at an auto parts store, and Derek did pool maintenance. After the festival, we decided to drive back during the middle of the night because the hotels near the area were ridiculously expensive, and we wanted to save money. At first, it seemed like a good idea. The road was relatively empty. The desert air had cooled down a lot after sunset, and we were still awake from the adrenaline of the event. The problem started a few hours later. As we got onto a secondary highway in the middle of Nevada, the cell phone signal completely disappeared in several stretches, and the road started feeling more and more isolated. There were no gas stations, restaurants, or nearby towns. Just miles of asphalt cutting through sand, rocks, and small dark hills on the horizon. The car also started having problems with the air conditioning, so the inside became stuffy even with the windows partially open. We were tired, dehydrated, and beginning to argue about which route the GPS had told us to take because the app kept freezing without proper signal. It was around 2 a.m. when Derek suggested stopping for a few minutes to rest before continuing to drive. We found an open area near the road where there was what looked like an old trailer partially buried in sand. Honestly, at the time, it just seemed like one of those abandoned structures left forgotten in the desert for decades. The trailer leaned slightly to one side, with part of the wheels almost buried, peeling paint, and rust spread across the sides. There were no lights nearby, no fence, no other parked vehicles. Just sand, wind, and silence. Even so, we decided to stop there because Derek wanted to check the engine and I desperately needed water. The desert wind was cold at that hour of the night, but the air still felt too dry in my throat. When I stepped out of the car, I remember the unbelievable silence around us. There were no insects, no passing cars, absolutely nothing besides the wind blowing sand softly against the rusted trailer. The only illumination came from our car headlights and the moon partially hidden behind thin clouds. Derek started working near the hood while I walked a few feet away trying to find cell phone signal, holding my phone up in the air like an idiot. That was when I heard a sound coming from the trailer. A knock. Low. Metallic. Like someone slowly tapping on a hollow wall. At first I thought it was the wind moving some loose piece of the structure, but a few seconds later I heard it again. Knock, 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 slow rhythm. Far too regular to be the wind. I stood there staring at the trailer for a few seconds, trying to understand if I'd really heard that. Derek still had his head near the engine, shining his cell phone flashlight on something, so I asked if he heard it. He looked up slightly annoyed, thinking I was joking, but before he answered, the knocking came again. This time a little louder. 3 slow bangs clearly coming from inside the trailer. The sound seemed muffled by the rust and the sand packed around the structure, but it was impossible to confuse it with the wind. Derek immediately went silent. His expression changed from, "Stop messing around," to, "What the hell was that?" in less than a second. We stood there in front of the car headlights listening to the wind passing under the trailer and dragging sand against the metal. The smell of hot dust and engine oil drifted from the open hood. My phone still had no signal, and that started weighing on me more at that moment. I remember trying to find a normal explanation. Maybe some animal trapped inside. Maybe a loose door hitting the interior wall. Maybe a homeless person using the abandoned trailer as shelter. But we were in the middle of a secondary desert highway with no town nearby, and none of that really made sense. Derek quietly said we should get back in the car and leave, but right after that we heard a voice. It was faint, muffled, coming from inside. Someone saying something I couldn't understand. We slowly approached the trailer even though we both knew it was a terrible idea. I think it was that mix of curiosity and fear of leaving someone trapped there. I kept my cell phone flashlight pointed at the rusted side, while Derek stayed slightly behind me. The trailer door was partially on the other side facing a small mound of sand, and it looked almost stuck from rust. There were old marks on the metal, scratches near the handle, and a chain lying on the ground half covered by sand. That immediately bothered me because the chain didn't seem like part of the trailer originally. It looked like something someone had used to keep the door shut at some point. When we got closer, the knocking stopped completely. The silence became so heavy that I could hear my own breathing and the low creaking of the open hood behind us. Derek loudly asked if someone was inside. For a few seconds, nobody answered. Then a female voice came from inside, very quiet and shaky. She said, "Please, don't stay here." I felt such a strong, cold sensation in my stomach that I almost stepped backward. Derek looked at me with wide eyes. The voice continued, now slightly more urgent, still muffled by the door. "Go. You need to go before they come back." At that moment, my entire body went on alert. It didn't sound like a joke. It didn't sound like some drunk person lost in the desert. The woman's voice carried real fear, the kind you recognize instantly even without seeing the person. Derek moved closer to the door, asking who was inside and whether she needed help. There was no answer for a few seconds, just muffled breathing from the other side of the rusted structure. The wind started blowing harder at that moment, throwing sand against our legs and making the trailer metal creak slowly. I remember automatically looking around for the first time since we had stopped there. And that was when I truly realized how isolated that place was. There wasn't a single light on the horizon, no houses, no gas stations, nothing except darkness and low dunes scattered near the road. Derek tried pulling the trailer door, but it barely moved because it seemed jammed by the sand built up underneath. When he forced it harder, the metal released a horrible screech. The opening became just wide enough to create a narrow gap, and then we could see part of the woman's face inside. She looked terrified. Messy hair, extremely pale skin, red eyes like she had been crying for hours. The inside of the trailer was completely dark except for a weak flashlight near the floor. And immediately I noticed something else. Her hands were tied with plastic zip ties. My stomach dropped instantly. Derek muttered a curse under his breath and tried opening the door more, but the woman started shaking her head desperately. She kept telling us to leave. "Please just leave. Right now." The way she said it felt even more frightening than the restraints themselves. It wasn't someone asking for help normally. It sounded like someone terrified of the possibility that we might stay there. I started looking around again with that horrible feeling that we were being watched without realizing it. And that was exactly when I noticed lights appearing far out in the desert. Small at first, too low to be streetlights or houses. Vehicle headlights. One, then another. Then more appearing from different directions between the dark dunes. My heart immediately started pounding, because none of them were coming from the main highway. They seemed to be moving off-road directly through the sand. And the strangest part was that the vehicles weren't using high beams, just low headlights gliding slowly through the darkness. Derek noticed it instantly too. The woman started speaking faster, almost panicking. "They're back. Oh my God, just go." That was when we heard the distant sound of engines coming from more than one direction at the same time. At that moment, the entire situation changed completely in my head. Up until then, there was still a part of me trying to find some rational explanation for everything. Maybe trafficking. Maybe some horrible domestic situation. But when I saw those headlights moving slowly through the dunes around the trailer, I realized we had stopped exactly where we shouldn't have. The sound of the engines became clearer in the silence of the desert. They weren't coming fast. That was the worst part. The vehicles seemed to be approaching without any hurry, like they knew exactly where they were going. Derek tried pulling the trailer door one more time to free the woman, but she practically panicked, saying there wasn't enough time. Her voice shook so badly that some words were hard to understand. "Please just leave," she repeated several times while staring toward the lights appearing across the desert. I remember feeling the cold wind against my face while my brain tried deciding between helping that woman or running back to the car immediately. And honestly, even now I feel guilty thinking about it. Because in that moment, the only thing my body wanted to do was get away from there as fast as possible. The headlights started surrounding the area in a way that felt planned. One vehicle appeared near the right side of the trailer. Another showed up farther away behind the low dunes on the other side. None of them accelerated. None used horns or high beams. They just kept moving slowly through the darkness. Derek finally let go of the door and practically shouted for us to get back in the car. The woman began crying inside the trailer, begging us not to talk to them if they caught us. That terrified me so badly that my legs went weak for a second. We ran back to the car, stumbling through the sand while the engines got closer and closer. When I jumped into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut, I quickly looked through the back window. One of the vehicles was already close enough for me to partially make out the body shape. It looked like an old pickup truck covered in desert dust. I couldn't see faces because the headlights were positioned strangely, but I could tell there were at least 2 people inside. Derek started the car in such a rush that he almost stalled the engine on the first attempt. And that was when something even worse happened. A powerful flashlight beam suddenly appeared from the darkness near the trailer, aimed directly at us. The moment that flashlight hit the windshield, Derek accelerated immediately without waiting another second. The tires spun in the loose sand before finally gaining enough traction to throw the car back toward the road. My heart was pounding at an insane level, and I remember automatically looking in the rearview mirror while the back of the car fishtailed across the uneven sand. The pickup truck started moving faster at that point. Until then, they had been approaching slowly, but as soon as we got into the car, the engines roared through the desert. The sound echoed horribly through the emptiness. The trailer disappeared quickly into the darkness, and the last thing I saw was the woman still standing in the crack of the door staring toward us. That still gives me a terrible feeling because it felt like we were abandoning someone there. Derek could barely keep the car straight while we headed back toward the highway, because sand covered part of the shoulder, and the secondary road was far too narrow. The headlights of the trucks appeared and disappeared behind the small rises in the terrain, but they kept getting closer. And then we realized something even worse. One of the vehicles was trying to reach the main road through the side of the desert to intercept us farther ahead. I started yelling at Derek to drive faster while I desperately watched the mirrors. Derek's car had already been making strange engine noises before we stopped at the trailer, and it seemed to struggle gaining speed on that empty road. Wind pushed through tiny gaps in the windows, creating a constant whistling sound inside the vehicle. The entire desert looked completely dark except for our headlights and the lights moving behind us. Then one of the vehicles finally reached the road a short distance behind us. It was a dark pickup truck throwing dust into the air while accelerating without turning on high beams. That scared me even more because it felt intentional, like they didn't want to attract attention from anyone else on the highway. Derek grabbed his phone trying to call the police, but we still had no signal in that region. No bars, nothing. The dashboard light illuminated his face and I could clearly see he was panicking. At one point, the truck behind us got close enough to partially illuminate the inside of our car through the mirrors. And that was when I noticed something even worse. There were more than 2 people inside. I could see at least 3 silhouettes moving around in the cab while the vehicle rapidly closed the distance behind us. At that point, I honestly thought we weren't going to make it off that road. Derek's car started vibrating heavily as he pushed it to maximum speed along that narrow highway full of cracks and sand piled along the edges. The truck behind us kept slowly gaining ground. The low headlights lit up the inside of our car intermittently every time the road curved slightly. My heart was beating so hard that my chest hurt. And the worst part was the silence between us inside the car. Neither of us knew what to do besides keep driving. At one point, Derek said maybe we should try getting back to the main highway and find any gas station or lit area. The problem was that we still had several miles before the next major exit. Then the truck behind us suddenly accelerated. The engine became much louder, and it started closing the distance way too fast. I looked in the mirror, and for the first time I could clearly see part of the front of the vehicle. Dust covering the grille, a cracked windshield on one side, and 2 people in the cab staring straight ahead. They didn't look like drunk idiots messing around in the desert. They looked completely focused on catching us, and then they did the worst possible thing. The truck swerved partially to the side, trying to bump the rear of our car. Derek jerked the wheel immediately and almost drove off the road. The tires scraped through the sandy shoulder while the car shook violently. I slammed my shoulder against the door hard enough to hurt, and remember smelling hot rubber through the vents. The truck backed off for a few seconds before accelerating again. That was when we finally saw something on the horizon besides darkness. Lights, faint at first, but clearly a gas station or rest stop near the highway. Derek practically shouted when he saw them and pressed even harder on the gas. The truck behind us kept following, but I noticed something strange as we got closer to the lights. The vehicle slightly reduced speed, then slowed a little more. Like they didn't want to stay near a populated area. My entire body was still shaking while the car sped toward the lit gas station. And seconds before we pulled into the pumps, I looked one last time in the mirror. The truck was already slowing down in the darkness of the road, partially stopped off the side of the highway watching us from a distance. When we finally stopped at the gas station, my legs felt so weak I could barely get out of the car. The place was small, one of those isolated highway gas stations with a 24-hour convenience store for truckers. Even so, seeing other people there was one of the greatest feelings of relief I've ever experienced. There were 2 semi-trucks parked near the pumps, and a man filling up an old pickup truck on the other side of the lot. Derek ran into the store practically dragging his phone, trying to get signal to call the police. I stayed outside constantly staring toward the dark road we had come from. The pickup truck was still parked far enough away to nearly disappear into the desert, but you could still make out the low headlights in the distance. That gave me chills because it felt like they were watching us decide what to do. After several minutes, the headlights finally shut off completely. We never saw the vehicle drive away. The lights simply disappeared into the darkness. That scared me even more because it meant they might still have been somewhere nearby out of sight from the main road. When the police finally arrived around 40 minutes later, we told them everything as quickly as possible while still trying to calm down. 2 officers drove back with us to the trailer area shortly before sunrise, and that ended up being one of the most disturbing parts of the entire story. The trailer was still there, partially buried in the sand exactly where we had left it. But there were no vehicles nearby, no visible fresh truck tracks in the desert besides the confusing marks left behind by the wind during the night. When the officers opened the trailer door, they found the inside practically empty. Just old bottles, dirt, a torn mattress, and food wrappers scattered around. No woman, no clear sign of someone living there. The strangest thing was that there were fresh marks from cut plastic restraints near one of the interior walls. One of the officers commented that criminal groups sometimes used isolated areas in that region for human trafficking and illegal transport along the secondary desert roads. We never found out exactly who those people were or what they were doing with that trailer buried in the sand. And honestly, I don't even know what happened to the woman we found inside that night. But to this day, when I think about that empty road in Nevada, the part that scares me most isn't the pickup trucks chasing our car. It's remembering how desperately she kept telling us to leave before they came back. Because she clearly knew exactly what happened to people who stayed there too long. Story 2. I was 31 years old when this happened, and at the time I worked maintaining industrial equipment for companies scattered across rural Utah and Nevada. My job basically consisted of traveling alone, driving between small towns, mines, warehouses, and isolated industrial areas where almost nobody wanted to stay for very long. I spent hours on deserted roads practically every week, so I was used to silence, darkness, and those endless highways cutting through salt flats and desert. That night I was returning from a work trip near Wendover after an absurd delay on a maintenance job that should have been finished before sunset. I ended up leaving way too late and decided to drive through the night because I wanted to get to Salt Lake City before the next morning. The problem was that I was already dangerously tired. My eyes burned, coffee had stopped helping, and I had been driving practically alone for more than 2 hours without seeing almost any cars on the road. The weather also felt strange that night. It wasn't exactly fog, but a mixture of fine sand blowing from the salt flats and cold moisture that made the entire horizon look pale white. In several stretches, my headlights seemed to illuminate nothing but a wall of light-colored dust ahead of the road. There were no streetlights, houses, or any illumination besides the straight highway crossing, that enormous emptiness in the middle of Utah. I clearly remember the moment I saw the bus for the first time because it immediately looked out of place. I was driving along a practically straight road surrounded by white salt and dry dirt when I noticed yellow lights stopped on the shoulder a few hundred feet ahead. At first I thought it was some maintenance vehicle or parked truck, but as I got closer I could make out the shape of an old school bus, one of those long yellow models used in small towns. It was parked partially off the road with the interior lights on. The problem was the time. It was already past 2 in the morning, and there was absolutely nothing in that region besides miles of empty highway. No nearby town, no school. No logical reason for a school bus to be stopped there at that hour. Even so, I slowed down a little because I thought maybe someone needed mechanical help. That was when I managed to see inside through the lit windows. There were people sitting inside. A lot of them, motionless. Dark silhouettes scattered through the seats facing the road. And I immediately felt that bad sensation in my stomach, because none of them seemed to be talking, moving, or doing anything normal. They simply looked like they were sitting there watching cars pass by on that empty highway. As I got closer to the bus, I started noticing more details that made the situation even stranger. The windows were partially fogged up from the inside, so I couldn't clearly see faces, only dark outlines of people sitting in the seats. What bothered me most was the complete lack of movement inside. It didn't look like a group of students, workers, or people waiting for help. No heads turned, nobody stood up, no cell phone lights appeared in the windows. Just those motionless silhouettes staring toward the road while the bus's yellowish interior lighting made everything look even more disturbing. My car engine sounded absurdly loud in the silence of the desert. When I drove closer to the shoulder, I noticed something else. The bus door was closed and there was no visible driver in the front seat. That immediately gave me chills because it meant all those people were sitting there in the dark without anyone driving or organizing anything. My first reaction was to think maybe it was some broken-down transport vehicle waiting for assistance. But then I quickly looked through my side mirror while passing the bus and had the very clear sensation that several heads turned to follow my car at the exact same time. My entire body went on alert at that moment. The road ahead remained completely empty, surrounded only by pale salt flats and that sandy haze blowing low across the ground. I tried to rationalize the situation while increasing my speed. Maybe it was a group of workers or people from some trip temporarily stopped there. But nothing made sense, especially the absolute silence inside the bus. And then something happened that made me freeze instantly. In the rearview mirror, I saw the lights inside the bus shut off for a second. Then the vehicle suddenly started up. The headlights came on directly behind me, and the bus slowly pulled onto the road. My heart started pounding immediately. The vehicle gained speed much faster than I expected for something so old. In less than a minute, it was following my car down the same completely empty highway. And the worst part was that it maintained exactly the same distance behind me the entire time. It didn't fully catch up. It didn't fall behind. It just followed. The entire desert faintly reflected the yellow bus headlights through the fine dust drifting across the road, while I tried convincing myself there still had to be a normal explanation. For the first few minutes, I tried to stay rational. I thought maybe the driver had stopped for a quick problem and was now simply continuing the trip in the same direction as me. The problem was that the longer it continued, the more wrong it felt. The bus maintained exactly the same distance behind my car no matter what speed I drove. When I sped up slightly, it sped up too. When I slowed because of the sand blowing across the road, it slowed the same way, and there was something else deeply bothering me. I couldn't clearly see anyone in the driver's seat. The bus headlights were too bright and reflected in my mirrors, but every time I tried focusing carefully, it looked like there was only darkness behind the windshield. My heart started racing at an uncomfortable level by then. The highway remained completely empty for miles. No gas stations, no exits, no other cars passing. Just me, that straight road crossing the salt flats, and the bus behind me in the middle of the night. That was when I heard the first impact coming from inside the bus. A loud thud, strong enough to echo across the silent road even through my car windows. I immediately looked in the rearview mirror, thinking maybe a door had come loose or some object had fallen inside. But seconds later, I heard it again. Bang. This time I could clearly see movement in the bus's side windows. Something hitting the inside glass. It didn't look like a person simply walking through the aisle. It looked like weight being thrown against the windows. My stomach instantly turned cold. Then came another impact. And another. The silhouettes inside the bus no longer seemed motionless. Some moved quickly between the seats, but in a strange, disorganized way. I couldn't fully understand what was happening inside, because the sand in the air distorted the headlights and the fogged windows hid the details. Even so, I could clearly tell something heavy was repeatedly slamming against the interior sides of the vehicle. My entire body went into full alert at that point. I started accelerating harder, trying to put distance between us, but the bus immediately responded by increasing speed too. Its engine made a deep, uneven sound in the silence of the highway, while it continued behind my car without drifting even a foot from the lane. And then I finally managed to make something out through the front windshield of the bus. A silhouette standing near the front of the aisle, staring directly toward my car. When I saw that figure standing near the front of the aisle, I felt such an intense chill through my body that my hands started sweating on the steering wheel despite the cold air coming through the vents. The silhouette didn't appear seated like the others. It was standing motionless in the bus aisle, staring directly ahead, while the vehicle followed my car down that completely empty highway. The worst part was that I still couldn't clearly see the driver. Every time the headlights reflected differently on the windshield, it looked like someone was driving. Other times it seemed completely empty. My brain started entering that strange paranoid state where you try to find logic for something absurd. I thought maybe it was a drunk group returning from some event. Maybe they were trying to scare drivers on the highway, but that didn't explain the violent impacts against the inside windows or the way the bus continued maintaining exactly the same distance behind me. Then came another louder crash, this time loud enough that I could hear it clearly even over my accelerating engine. Through the rearview mirror, I saw one of the side windows of the bus shake violently, as if someone had been thrown hard against it from the inside. My heart was racing at an insane level by then. I grabbed my cell phone trying to call highway patrol, but the signal constantly disappeared in that salt flat region. Sometimes one bar appeared, then vanished again. No calls would connect. The road ahead felt endless. Just darkness, white sand reflecting the headlights and that bus behind me in the middle of the night. Then I started noticing something else disturbing. The bus was slowly getting closer now. Not quickly, very slowly, but clearly reducing the distance between us. Its engine made a heavy, uneven sound while the headlights completely filled my mirrors, and the impacts kept coming from inside at strange intervals. Bang! A few seconds of silence, then another one. At one point, I glanced quickly into the side mirror and saw one of the bus windows partially open despite the speed, and for a split second, an arm came out through the opening, moving far too quickly before disappearing back inside the vehicle. My stomach dropped instantly because it didn't look like someone trying to ask for help. It looked like chaos happening inside, and then for the first time since everything started, I heard a short honk from the bus echoing across the empty highway behind me. That short honk scared me more than the impacts against the windows, because until then the bus had seemed almost silent, as if it were simply following me through the darkness. When the horn echoed through that empty road, the situation became much more real inside my head. My whole body went into panic mode. I started accelerating harder, even though I knew I was already above a safe speed for that narrow road covered in fine sand in some stretches. The steering wheel vibrated in my hands and the tires occasionally slipped slightly when the car passed over thicker patches of salt dust. The bus stayed behind me, always behind me, and getting closer each minute. I compulsively checked the mirrors, trying to understand what was happening inside. The silhouettes were now clearly moving between the seats. Some seemed to stand up, others disappeared from sight, and the impacts continued. At one point I heard a crash so loud that I clearly saw one of the side windows partially crack, before the figure disappeared back into the interior darkness. That was when I seriously started thinking maybe someone was trapped or being attacked inside that vehicle. But at the same time, the way the bus followed me felt far too deliberate to be coincidence. Then finally something appeared on the horizon besides road and white salt. Lights. Very faint at first, but clearly a rest stop or gas station near the main highway. I felt immediate relief mixed with desperation, because it was the first sign of human presence I had seen in nearly 40 minutes. As soon as I started getting closer to the lights, I noticed a strange change in the bus's behavior. For the first time since it started following me, it slowed down. It didn't stop immediately. It just gradually fell farther behind while staying in the same lane. My heart was still pounding while I practically gripped the steering wheel with both hands. When I finally pulled into the lit gas station near the highway, I immediately checked the rearview mirror, expecting the bus to follow me in. But it didn't. The vehicle stopped on the dark road several yards before the illuminated entrance. It stayed motionless there for a few seconds with its low beams pointed directly toward me, and then it simply turned its lights off. The bus completely disappeared into the darkness of the desert, as if it had never been there at all. I stayed parked in the gas station lot for several minutes, unable to get out of the car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. The place was small, but there were a few people there that night. 2 truck drivers inside the convenience store, a sleepy clerk behind the register, and a car parked near the pumps. Seeing other people after that empty road was one of the greatest feelings of relief I've ever experienced. Even so, I kept constantly staring out the window toward the dark highway, expecting the bus headlights to reappear. I quickly told the clerk what had happened, and at first he thought I was exaggerating because of exhaustion from the drive. But when he saw the condition I was in, he ended up calling Highway Patrol. While we waited, I tried using my cell phone again and finally got stable signal. The first thing I did was search for news about accidents or school buses in that Salt Flat region. I found nothing recent. The strangest part was that the more I thought about the bus, the more certain details started bothering me. Especially the fact that none of the figures inside seemed to react normally during the entire drive. They appeared agitated, but not in the way frightened passengers normally would. The police arrived around 40 minutes later and listened to the whole story in the parking lot. One of the officers even drove part of the road with me shortly before sunrise trying to locate the bus. We found absolutely nothing. No vehicle parked anywhere, no recent tracks leaving the road, nothing. And that became even stranger because in that Salt Flat region, any heavy vehicle would normally leave very visible marks off the highway. The officer eventually commented that some people use secondary desert roads for illegal transportation of immigrants, drugs, and even stolen vehicles precisely because there are very few patrols during the night. Honestly, to this day, I think that bus may have been used for something very wrong. Maybe those people inside weren't normal passengers at all. Maybe someone was transporting captives through isolated desert areas in that vehicle. I never found out. But what scares me most even now isn't the impacts against the windows, or the bus appearing through that sand haze. It's remembering the constant feeling that whoever was driving that vehicle deliberately chose to follow me down that empty road in the middle of the night. Because if I hadn't found that lit gas station along the highway, I honestly don't know how long that bus would have continued behind my car in the middle of the Utah desert. Story 3. I've worked in landscape and night sky photography since my early 20s, and a huge part of my job has always involved driving alone through isolated areas of Arizona, Utah, and Nevada, looking for places without light pollution. At the time this happened, I was 34 years old and doing freelance work selling photos to small magazines, travel websites, and stock image companies. I was already used to silence, empty roads, and spending entire nights alone in the desert. That's exactly why it took me so long to realize how wrong that situation was from the very beginning. I had found that canyon after researching astrophotography forums where some people mentioned an extremely dark area near northern Arizona. It wasn't a national park or famous tourist spot. It was basically a secondary dirt road leading to an isolated rock formation where almost nobody passed through during the night. I left Flagstaff late in the afternoon driving alone in my SUV, loaded with photography gear, water, and enough supplies to spend a few hours there before returning to the city in the morning. The sky was perfectly clear, with no strong moonlight that night, exactly the kind of conditions ideal for night photography. As I drove farther and farther down the dirt roads, cell phone signals started disappearing in several areas. That wasn't unusual for that region, so I didn't think much about it. The real problem was the silence of that place. The farther I got from the main highway, the fewer signs of human presence existed around me. I arrived at the canyon entrance a little after 11 at night. The place was even more isolated than I imagined from the online photos. The rock formations created narrow corridors of dark stone on both sides, and the wind made a constant sound passing between the canyon walls. The ground was covered in fine sand mixed with small rocks that crunched beneath the SUV tires. I parked in a small open area near a taller rock formation and started unloading my equipment. I clearly remember the dry cold of that night. It wasn't freezing, but the desert air made everything feel cold fast after midnight. I set up my tripod, organized my lenses, and started preparing the camera while looking at the unbelievably clear sky above the canyon. It was one of those places where you can see thousands of stars with incredible sharpness. At first, it felt exactly like the kind of peaceful night I had been searching for. I took some initial photos and spent maybe 40 minutes completely alone there, hearing nothing except the wind and the camera shutter clicking. That was when I noticed the first light. Small, distant, appearing high up on one of the rock formations above me. At first, I thought it was another photographer hiking the trail, but a few seconds later, another light appeared farther away, then another one. small flashlights moving slowly across the dark top of the canyon. At first, I genuinely tried not to think it was strange. Remote areas in Arizona sometimes attract other photographers, campers, or people hiking at night. Even so, something about the way those lights moved started bothering me quickly. They didn't look like flashlights from people walking normally along a trail. They moved too slowly, and almost always stopped at the same time before continuing again. I watched them for a few minutes while adjusting my camera, trying to convince myself I was exaggerating because I was alone in the dark. The wind made a constant low sound passing between the rocks, and every once in a while I could hear fine sand sliding down the canyon walls. The flashlights kept gradually appearing at different points along the rock formations above me. After some time, I counted at least 6 separate lights. What truly gave me chills was realizing they seemed to be slowly descending the sides of the canyon toward the area where my SUV was parked. None of them moved quickly. None pointed directly ahead like someone looking for a path. They seemed too controlled, almost coordinated, and there were no voices coming from above. Absolute silence besides the wind. My entire body started entering that uncomfortable alert state where your brain tries to find normal explanations for something that clearly feels wrong. I grabbed the powerful flashlight I kept beside my backpack and quickly aimed it at one of the rock formations, trying to identify the people up there. The beam barely reached part of the rocks before disappearing into darkness. I couldn't see faces or bodies, just small reflections moving between the stones. Then one of the flashlights shut off completely, then another. The others continued descending slowly. That was when I started feeling that awful sensation of being watched from multiple places at once. I decided it might be better to pack up my gear and leave before the situation became even stranger. Honestly, even now I still can't explain exactly why I became so uncomfortable so quickly. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way the lights seemed to be getting closer without any sound of conversation or footsteps coming from the rocks. I started taking apart the tripod faster while constantly looking toward the formations above the canyon. And that was when I noticed something else. Some of the flashlights were no longer high above. They now seemed much closer to the ground, much closer to my vehicle. At that moment, I completely gave up on continuing to photograph. My instincts clearly told me I needed to leave while I still could. I started packing my equipment way too fast, practically throwing lenses and cables into the bags without the normal care I always had working in photography. The wind seemed stronger by that point in the night, creating small whirlwinds of sand between the rocks around the canyon, and the silence kept deeply bothering me. Even with those flashlights approaching, I still couldn't hear voices. No distant conversations, no clear sounds of people walking across the rocks. Just lights appearing and disappearing slowly between the formations. My heart truly started racing when I finally looked toward the SUV again. There was a flashlight stopped near the rear of the vehicle, low, very close to the ground. I froze immediately, trying to understand whether someone was actually beside my SUV or if the light was coming from behind the rocks. Then it shut off, simply disappeared into the darkness. My stomach dropped instantly. I grabbed the backpacks and started walking quickly toward the SUV while keeping my flashlight pointed toward the sides of the canyon. When I finally reached the vehicle, I felt that immediate cold sensation in my body that comes before your brain even understands what's wrong. The SUV was leaning slightly to one side. At first I thought it was the uneven terrain, but then I pointed the flashlight at the rear right tire and saw it completely flat. There was a long cut along the sidewall of the rubber. It didn't look like an accidental blowout from a rock. It looked like a slash made with a knife or something sharp. My heart pounded so hard I started feeling dizzy. And before I could fully process that, I noticed something even worse. There were large rocks stacked directly behind the vehicle, not naturally scattered, deliberately stacked into a low barrier near the rear tires. My brain immediately went into panic mode because I realized someone had been near the SUV while I was photographing the sky. And I hadn't heard absolutely anything. No footsteps, no conversation, no engine from another vehicle arriving. That was when I heard the first whistle echoing through the canyon walls. Long, low, coming from somewhere distant between the dark rocks. A few seconds later, another whistle answered from a different direction, then another one. My blood ran cold because the sounds didn't seem random. They sounded like signals. people communicating in the dark around the canyon. At that moment, my entire body switched into survival mode. It wasn't discomfort or paranoia from being alone in the desert anymore. I knew there were people around the canyon watching my movements, and the worst part was realizing how close those people had gotten to the SUV without making almost any sound. The whistles continued echoing between the stone walls at strange intervals. One came from the left, then another farther behind me. Some were short, others longer, and always followed by complete silence afterward. My heart was beating so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears while desperately scanning the rock formations with the flashlight. I couldn't see anyone directly, just shadows, stone, and darkness. Several times I thought I caught quick movement between the lower rocks, but whenever I pointed the light, there was nothing. The wind made the entire canyon produce strange little echoes, and mixed with the whistles, it created a horrible feeling of being surrounded without knowing exactly where the danger was coming from. I immediately grabbed my cell phone trying to get signal, but the screen showed no service, no bars, nothing. My stomach sank even more because I realized I was alone, trapped in the middle of that canyon with a slashed tire and people moving around in the dark. I started throwing the rest of the equipment into the SUV as fast as possible while trying to think of a rational escape. I had a spare tire, but changing it at that moment seemed impossible, especially because the whistles were getting closer. Then I heard something else. Rocks shifting, not far from the vehicle. A short sound of gravel sliding followed by immediate silence. I pointed the flashlight in that direction and for a split second illuminated someone partially standing between two rock formations. Just a silhouette. Tall, motionless. The person disappeared immediately behind the rocks the second the light hit them. My entire body froze. And seconds later came another whistle much closer than the others. So close it sounded like it came from the upper part of the canyon directly above the SUV. At that moment, I understood that staying there was the worst possible decision. I got into the SUV and started the engine immediately, while trying to decide if I should risk driving with the destroyed tire. The problem was that the terrain around where I parked was filled with rocks and uneven ground. If I completely ruined the wheel out there in the middle of nowhere, I probably wouldn't get out of the canyon at all. That was when I heard a heavy impact from somewhere behind the SUV, like a large rock slamming against the body of the vehicle. As soon as that rock hit the back of the SUV, I completely lost any attempt to stay calm. My whole body was shaking while I gripped the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do in seconds. The whistles stopped immediately after the impact, and that sudden silence was worse than hearing them echo through the canyon. It felt like they were waiting for my reaction. Then I heard another sound coming from the left side of the vehicle. Fast footsteps over gravel. Not many, just a few. Close enough for me to clearly recognize someone running between the rocks near the SUV. I pointed the flashlight through the window in that direction, but couldn't illuminate anyone directly. The beam only hit sand, stone, and small clouds of dust lifted by the wind. My heart was racing at an insane level. I knew that if I stayed there, those people would probably keep getting closer. So I decided to take the risk. I shifted into gear and slowly started moving the SUV even with the ruined tire. The vehicle made a horrible sound of metal and rubber scraping against rocks, but it could still move. And the moment the headlights started illuminating the narrow canyon exit, I heard several whistles erupt at the same time from different points around the rocks. That was when I finally saw people clearly for the first time. Not faces, but silhouettes. At least 3 figures appearing quickly between the rock formations as the SUV headlights bounced across the uneven terrain. None of them seemed to be trying to speak to me. They just moved quickly through the rocks following the vehicle while the whistles continued echoing. One of them appeared too close to the side of the SUV for a second, and I noticed he was carrying a flashlight in one hand and something long in the other. Maybe a piece of wood or a tool. My stomach instantly dropped. I pressed harder on the accelerator, ignoring the horrible sound of the destroyed wheel grinding through sand and stone. The SUV shook violently while trying to reach the main road outside the canyon again. At one point, I heard another rock hit the back of the vehicle. Then another slammed onto the roof. And then, just before reaching the wider opening of the canyon, I saw something else that still bothers me to remember. There was a vehicle parked without headlights behind some rocks farther ahead, almost completely hidden in the darkness, as if it had already been waiting there before I even arrived. When I saw that vehicle hidden near the canyon exit, I felt such intense panic that my hands almost slipped off the steering wheel. I couldn't clearly identify the model because it was completely dark, but it looked like an old pickup truck parked partially behind the rocks in a position where it wouldn't be visible from the main road. And I immediately understood what that meant. Those people had probably been there long before I arrived to photograph the canyon. My brain started connecting everything at once. The flashlights appearing along the rock formations, the tire being cut without any sound, the rocks stacked behind the SUV, the whistles coordinating movements in the dark. It felt planned, not like some random group of hikers scaring tourists. I accelerated as hard as possible, completely ignoring the sound of the ruined wheel smashing against the rough terrain. The SUV bounced violently, while the headlights illuminated sand, rocks, and clouds of dust flying across the front of the vehicle. At one point, one of the silhouettes appeared running alongside the left side of the canyon, trying to keep up with the SUV for a few seconds before disappearing again behind the rocks. The whistles continued echoing behind me, now sounding more agitated. Closer. My heart was pounding so hard I started feeling dizzy while trying to keep the vehicle aimed toward the narrow canyon exit, and then I finally reached the main road again. The moment the front tires touched asphalt was one of the greatest feelings of relief I've ever experienced. I kept driving even with the destroyed tire until I spotted the lights of a small gas station several miles beyond the canyon exit. I only stopped there because the SUV could barely continue moving anymore. When I got out of the vehicle, my legs were shaking so badly I had to lean against the door for a few seconds. The rear side of the SUV was dented where the rocks had hit it, and the ruined tire was practically shedding pieces of rubber. I immediately called local police and explained everything. 2 officers returned with me to the canyon entrance shortly before sunrise, but we found nobody. No hidden vehicle, no flashlights. Nothing except my SUV tracks in the sand and some older tire marks near the rocks. One of the officers commented that certain isolated areas of Arizona are used by groups involved in illegal trafficking, equipment theft, and even ambushes against lost tourists. Honestly, to this day I don't know exactly who those people were or what they planned to do to me in that canyon. But the part that scares me most isn't the whistles or the flashlights descending the rocks. It's thinking about how close they managed to get to me completely silently, while I stood there alone looking at the sky through my camera without noticing anything around me. Story 4. I was 29 years old when this happened, and at the time I worked traveling between small towns in New Mexico, doing audits for a distribution company. My job required a lot of driving, especially through remote regions near Albuquerque, Roswell, and nearly deserted areas where sometimes you drive for more than an hour without passing another car. I was already used to empty highways, abandoned gas stations, and those massive southwestern landscapes where it feels like nothing exists besides sand, rock, and sky. That night I was driving back alone from a work trip near Farmington, after a delay forced me onto the road much later than I wanted. It was already past 10 at night when I started crossing an extremely empty stretch of highway in northern New Mexico. The wind had already been strong for a while, but in desert areas that doesn't always mean immediate trouble. The sky was partially covered and thin layers of dust occasionally crossed the road. I was driving with the radio low, trying to stay awake because I was already exhausted from the trip. The real problem started when the sandstorm worsened incredibly fast. In less than 15 minutes, visibility dropped dramatically. Dust crossed through the headlights like thick smoke, and several times I could barely see the lane markings on the road. The wind started hitting the side of the car so hard that I had to slow down considerably. There were practically no other vehicles on that highway at that hour, which made everything even more uncomfortable. The radio started cutting out because of the weather interference, and the sky completely disappeared behind the brown dust illuminated by the headlights. I remember feeling that physical tension of driving without being able to clearly see what existed farther down the road. That was when I noticed movement on the left side of the car. At first I thought it was just the reflection of sand passing through the headlights, but a few seconds later I clearly distinguished a dark vehicle driving parallel to me in the middle of the storm. What immediately scared me was the fact that it had no headlights on. Absolutely no lights, neither front nor rear. Just the dark silhouette appearing and disappearing between the clouds of dust beside my window. My heart started racing instantly because I had no idea how long that car had been there. I tried slowing down even more, hoping it would pass and leave. but the vehicle simply slowed down with me. It stayed exactly beside my car, maintaining the same distance while the sandstorm practically swallowed the entire highway around us. During the first few minutes, I tried convincing myself that maybe the driver was doing it because of the poor visibility. Maybe he was using my car as a reference to stay on the road during the storm, but the more time passed, the less normal it seemed. The car never passed me, never fell behind. It just remained perfectly parallel to mine, partially appearing through the dust before disappearing again. Sometimes I could make out pieces of the dark bodywork and the outline of the windshield. Other times it seemed to vanish completely inside the storm before reappearing beside my door seconds later. My heart started beating much faster when I realized something else. I couldn't see the driver's face. His window seemed too dark. And every time I tried looking directly in that direction, the sand illuminated by my own headlights distorted everything. The wind made the car sway slightly on the road while I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands started hurting. The highway remained completely empty besides that vehicle appearing and disappearing beside me in the middle of the storm. I tried accelerating a little to create distance, but the other car immediately accelerated too. Then I tried slowing down almost to the minimum safe speed. It slowed down as well. That was when I started feeling real fear, because it seemed far too deliberate to be coincidence. My mind entered that strange alert state where you begin imagining every possible bad outcome at once, while trying to keep driving normally. I grabbed my phone, trying to check for signal or search for a nearby gas station on the GPS, but the internet connection constantly failed because of the storm. Several times the map simply froze. And then something happened that immediately gave me chills. The dark car moved slightly closer to my side for a few seconds, close enough that I could partially see inside through the window. There was someone driving, but the person seemed to be staring directly at me the entire time. Not at the road, at me. Before I could distinguish any facial details, the dust swallowed the vehicle again. My stomach dropped at that moment. That was when I finally saw a faint structure appearing on the side of the highway a few miles ahead. An old abandoned gas station partially covered in sand. Honestly, I didn't want to stop there, but the storm was becoming so strong that continuing to drive felt increasingly dangerous. As I approached the station, visibility became even worse. Several times I was practically driving only by following the faint shoulder lines appearing through the sand. The building looked abandoned for years. The old pumps were rusted, and half the roof structure had twisted metal sheets rattling in the wind. No lights were working besides a small broken sign occasionally reflecting my headlights. Even so, I decided to pull in, because honestly it was becoming too dangerous to continue driving on that highway without seeing anything clearly. The moment I turned into the sand-covered parking area, I immediately felt the other vehicle making the same move behind me. My heart pounded hard instantly. The dark car slowly entered the station and parked several yards away from my vehicle. The engine remained running. That was the first thing that bothered me. No doors opened, no lights came on. The car simply remained motionless in the dark while the storm made sand constantly strike both vehicles. The sound of the wind at that abandoned station was horrible. The metal sheets on the roof vibrated and creaked non-stop while small clouds of dust crossed the parking area. I stayed inside the car, gripping the steering wheel without knowing what to do. The air conditioner made a constant low hum, and my windshield wipers kept moving even though they barely helped anymore. I tried calling state police, but my phone could barely hold one bar of signal. No calls went through. I looked several times at the car parked on the other side of the station, trying to see movement inside, but the windows were too dark and the storm distorted everything. At one point, I thought I saw someone sitting in the driver's seat staring in my direction without moving. The worst part was the engine remaining on the entire time. It created a horrible feeling that they were waiting for something. Then it finally happened. The vehicle door opened slowly. My entire body froze instantly. I couldn't distinguish a face or details because sand was blowing violently between the vehicles, but I could make out someone wearing dark clothing walking slowly toward my car. My heart started pounding at an insane level. Then I heard the first tap on the window. Tap. Light. Fingertips touching the passenger side glass. The moment I heard that tapping on the window, I felt such an intense cold sensation through my body that my hands immediately began trembling. The sound was very light, almost delicate. That was what scared me the most. It didn't sound like someone desperately asking for help during a storm. It sounded like someone trying to get my attention without any hurry at all. I slowly turned my head toward the passenger window and partially saw the silhouette of the person through the sand, blowing against the glass. Tall, thin, standing extremely close to the car. The face was impossible to distinguish because the storm practically erased all details. The wind made sand strike the vehicle in a constant hiss, while that person remained motionless outside. Then came 3 more light taps on the window. Tap, tap, tap. My heart was racing so hard I could feel the pulse in my neck. I tried acting rationally, telling myself maybe it was someone wanting shelter or mechanical help. But deep down I knew it didn't feel normal, especially because the other car still sat on the opposite side of the abandoned station with its engine running. Then the person slowly started walking around my vehicle. I followed the silhouette through the mirrors while it moved slowly between the dust and darkness. The fingers kept lightly tapping the windows while passing along the sides of the car. Tap, 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 always in the same slow rhythm. My whole body was frozen at that moment. I grabbed my cell phone again, desperately trying to get enough signal to call someone, but the screen constantly switched between 1 bar and no service. The wind outside kept getting stronger, making the metal structure of the station produce loud, creaking sounds above the cars. Then I lost sight of the person for a few seconds when they passed behind my vehicle. And that was exactly what sent me into panic, because I could no longer predict where they would appear next. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my hands started hurting, while frantically watching the mirrors covered in sand. Then I heard the sound directly behind me. Fingernails or fingers slowly dragging across the trunk lid. A long metallic scraping sound. My stomach immediately dropped, and seconds later another silhouette appeared near the dark car parked on the opposite side of the station. There was someone else there watching. The moment I noticed that second silhouette near the other car, my brain finally stopped trying to rationalize the situation and went into full panic. Until then, part of me was still trying to believe maybe it was just some bizarre situation caused by the storm, or a disturbed driver trying to get attention. But 2 people standing at that abandoned gas station during a sandstorm, one walking around my car while the other watched from a distance, no longer felt like coincidence at all. My heart was pounding so hard, I started struggling to breathe. The person behind my car kept slowly dragging fingers across the bodywork. The metallic sound moved over the trunk lid and along the side, slowly, as if intentionally trying to make me more nervous. I compulsively checked the mirrors trying to follow the movement, but the sand in the air made everything appear and disappear within seconds. Then the silhouette appeared again beside the driver's side window, very close. Close enough that I could partially see the face for the first time. It was a man, thin, skin heavily marked by dust and wind, and he wasn't looking at the road or the storm. He was staring directly at me through the glass while keeping a completely calm expression. Then he slowly raised one hand and pointed at my dashboard. My whole body went cold immediately because it took me a second to understand what he was showing me. The fuel warning light was on. I had planned to fill up before crossing that stretch of highway, but I postponed it because I wanted to reach the next town quickly. The man looked at the dashboard, then back at me, and gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. That terrified me because it felt like he knew exactly that I wouldn't be able to drive much farther in that storm without enough fuel. The second person remained standing near the dark car without moving. Then I heard another sound from outside. A door handle being pulled slowly. The man had tried opening the rear passenger door. My whole body reacted instantly. I shifted into gear immediately and slammed my foot on the accelerator without thinking about anything else. The tires spun violently in the accumulated sand before finally gaining enough traction to launch the car out of there. The man had to quickly step back to avoid being hit. And while I threw the car back onto the highway, practically unable to see anything except dust and headlights, I looked once through the rearview mirror. Both silhouettes remained standing at the abandoned station, watching my car disappear into the storm. I kept driving almost on autopilot for the next several miles. The storm was still intense, but at that moment I preferred any danger from the road over staying at that abandoned station for another second. My hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel that I constantly had to readjust my grip. The car swayed slightly from the side wind, and the sand crossing through the headlights made it feel like I was driving through thick smoke. Several times I desperately checked the mirrors, expecting to see the dark car appear behind me again without headlights. But there was nothing besides the storm swallowing the highway. Even so, I couldn't relax. My mind kept replaying the image of that man looking at the fuel gauge and smiling, because it meant he had been watching my vehicle carefully enough to notice details even I wasn't thinking about at the time. I kept driving until I finally reached a small illuminated area near a gas station, still operating on the outskirts of a smaller town off the main highway. Honestly, seeing other people there that night was one of the greatest feelings of relief in my life. I parked near the pumps, trembling before I could even turn the engine off. While refueling, I kept constantly looking toward the road, expecting headlights to appear through the storm. I briefly explained what happened to the gas station attendant, and he immediately asked exactly where I had stopped during the sandstorm. When I described the abandoned station on the highway, his expression changed instantly. He commented that many people avoided stopping in that area during sandstorms because there had been robberies and disappearances on nearby roads years earlier. According to him, groups took advantage of the low visibility to target stranded drivers in the middle of the desert without cell phone service. I never discovered whether those men really intended to rob my car, kidnap me, or something worse. But to this day, what disturbs me most about that night isn't remembering the person walking around my car tapping fingers on the windows. It's realizing how calm they seemed, as if they knew that in the middle of that sandstorm, I had almost nowhere to run. And honestly, I believe that if I had turned off the car at that abandoned station or stepped out of the vehicle for any reason, that night probably would have ended in a much worse way somewhere along that deserted New Mexico highway. Story 5. I've been driving trucks for more than 15 years, so I'm used to empty highways, late nights, and strange people on the CB radio. Anyone who spends enough time crossing Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona eventually hears everything during overnight drives. Drunk truckers, people trying to spread false information about highway patrol checkpoints, stupid jokes over the radio, and even clearly disturbed people talking to themselves on random channels. That's why when it started, my first reaction wasn't fear, it was irritation. Back then I was hauling industrial parts between El Paso and small towns in rural Texas. On the night this happened, I had decided to avoid part of the interstate because there were roadblocks and heavy traffic caused by an accident farther north. I chose to cut through using a few secondary roads in the middle of the desert. It wasn't illegal or particularly unusual for experienced truck drivers. The problem is that those alternate routes become unbelievably empty during the middle of the night. You can drive for hours without passing practically anyone besides isolated gas stations and the occasional lost car. That specific night, it was already past midnight, and I had been driving alone for quite a while. The desert was completely dark except for the dashboard lights and the truck's headlights cutting across the straight road in the middle of nowhere. The CB radio was playing quietly just to break the silence inside the cab, while I drank coffee trying to stay awake. I remember clearly the moment I heard the voice for the first time because it came through the radio incredibly clean. No heavy static, no normal long-distance interference. It was a calm male voice, probably an older man. At first I thought it was someone just trying to talk normally on the channel, but I immediately realized he was speaking specifically to me. The voice said, "You still got that blue keychain hanging near the dashboard?" My stomach tightened instantly, because I really did have a blue keychain hanging beside the radio for years. It was a small keychain from my daughter attached near the controls inside the cab. Even then, I still tried to rationalize it. Maybe another truck driver had seen me at a truck stop hours earlier. I kept driving without responding. Then the voice came back a few seconds later. That sticker on the driver's door is peeling off again. At that moment, I felt real cold run up my spine, because that was true too. I had an old company sticker partially torn near the driver's door for months, and it wasn't something visible from a distance on a dark highway. I immediately grabbed the radio microphone, asking who he was and exactly where he was. There were a few seconds of silence. Then the voice answered in a completely calm tone. "Right behind you." At that moment, I immediately looked into the truck mirrors, expecting to see headlights appearing behind the trailer on the road. There was absolutely nothing. Just darkness. The highway continued straight through the desert, and my mirrors reflected only the long side of the trailer disappearing into the darkness behind me. No car, no truck, no distant lights. My heart started racing even while I tried convincing myself it could still be some stupid radio prank. I grabbed the microphone again and asked who he was and how he knew those things about my cab. The voice took a few seconds to respond. During that time, I could hear only the deep rumble of the truck engine, the wind hitting the trailer, and the low hum of the CB radio. Then he spoke again, far too calm. "You should clean that coffee cup off the dashboard before it spills again." My stomach instantly went ice cold because there really was an empty coffee cup resting near the right side of the dashboard. That wasn't something someone could easily guess. My whole body entered that strange state of alert, where your brain desperately tries to find a logical explanation for something that clearly feels wrong. I started compulsively checking the mirrors, the shoulder of the road, and the dark horizon surrounding the highway. Nothing. The voice stayed silent for almost a full minute after that. And honestly, that silence made me even more nervous because I kept expecting to hear another impossible description about something inside the cab. The road in that region was completely isolated. There were no streetlights, towns, or practically any movement besides dry bushes passing through the headlights. The sky was clear and dark, full of stars, but the desert around me felt like absolute emptiness. That was when I noticed something different behind the trailer. At first I thought it was an illusion caused by reflections from my own headlights and the road dust, but a few seconds later I could see better through the left mirror. There were lights appearing behind the truck, very low, faint, and without normal headlights. They looked like small yellowish points of light moving in the darkness directly behind the trailer. My heart immediately started pounding. The vehicle was far enough away that I couldn't distinguish the model or shape clearly, but something was definitely following me now. And the worst part was that it still wasn't using normal headlights. Before I grabbed the radio microphone again, the voice returned, this time speaking in an even lower tone. "Don't stop when you see the car sideways across the road." The moment I heard that, my entire body went cold. It wasn't just a quick roadside scare. It was a heavy feeling in my stomach, like my brain had finally realized this wasn't some trucker joke over the radio. My hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard they started hurting. I looked again into the mirrors, trying to see the vehicle behind the trailer more clearly, but the lights still looked too strange. They didn't resemble normal headlights illuminating the road. They were low, almost hidden, appearing and disappearing as the highway rolled over slight desert hills. And the worst part was that the voice on the radio went completely silent after saying that sentence. The silence inside the cab became horrible at that moment. All I could hear was the truck engine, the constant sound of tires on asphalt and the wind crossing the side of the trailer. My heart was racing at an insane level while I tried deciding whether this was a real threat or some kind of psychological trap. I grabbed my phone trying to call highway patrol, but in that region of Texas the signal constantly failed. No calls went through. I kept driving faster, trying to reach some truck stop or town entrance before anything worse happened. That was when I saw something appearing ahead on the road. At first it looked like a shadow partially blocking the shoulder, but as I got closer, the truck headlights illuminated the scene better. There was a car stopped sideways across part of the road. Dark sedan, driver's door open, no lights on, no hazard flashers. My heart pounded so hard I felt heat rise into my face despite the cool air inside the cab. Immediately I remembered exactly what the voice had said over the radio. "Don't stop when you see the car sideways across the road." My mind instantly conflicted because part of me thought there might be someone injured there needing help. But another part realized how wrong it all felt, especially on that completely empty road in the middle of the night. Then I noticed something else. There was nobody visible near the car. No movement, no person signaling for help. Just the vehicle sitting sideways blocking part of the dark highway. The problem was that the road at that stretch was too narrow for the truck to pass safely without slowing down drastically. I quickly checked the mirrors again. The low lights without headlights were still behind the trailer, much closer now. And at that exact moment, the voice came back on the CB radio for the third time. Very low, almost too calm. "Keep driving." At that moment, I stopped trying to understand what was happening and simply reacted on instinct. I gripped the steering wheel hard and pushed the truck partially onto the shoulder, trying to pass the sideways car without fully stopping. The trailer swayed heavily behind me when the right side tires hit dirt and gravel off the pavement. For a few seconds, I thought I was going to lose control because the side of the truck started vibrating violently over the uneven ground. But I managed to keep enough speed to continue moving. As the headlights illuminated the sedan better, I noticed something that immediately gave me chills. The car looked empty. Nobody in the driver's seat, nobody lying near the road, nothing. Just the open door swaying slightly in the desert wind. And then, at the exact moment my truck began passing beside the sedan, I saw movement in the darkness along the shoulder. Silhouettes. At least two people suddenly appearing from the side of the road as if they had been hiding behind the car waiting. My heart started pounding at an insane level. One of them ran a few steps toward the truck cab before disappearing back into the darkness when I drove past without slowing down. At that same moment, I heard a loud metallic bang coming from the side of the trailer, like something hitting the body of the truck as I passed. My whole body froze because for a second I thought someone had managed to grab onto the back. I kept accelerating as hard as the truck allowed on that secondary road, while desperately checking the mirrors. The lights behind the trailer started moving faster right after I passed the sideways sedan. Now I could clearly tell it was a vehicle following my truck without its main headlights on. Its engine became audible through the wind and the noise of the trailer. Then the CB radio crackled again. The same male voice let out a quiet little laugh before saying, "Thought you were gonna stop." That terrified me so badly my hands started trembling on the wheel. I kept driving without responding while searching for any sign of a truck stop, town entrance, or movement on the road. The vehicle behind me kept following at a constant distance in the dark. And the worst part was realizing that the voice on the radio sounded completely calm the entire time. Like someone watching everything unfold exactly the way he planned it. I kept driving for several more miles practically without blinking. My entire body was so tense it started causing pain in my shoulders and hands. The truck cut through the dark desert while the engine made that constant rumble inside the cab. But even so, I could still hear the vehicle behind me at certain moments when the wind died down. I checked the mirrors every few seconds expecting headlights to fully appear, but I continued seeing only those low lights following the trailer from a distance. At one point, I seriously considered stopping the truck in the middle of the road and trying to confront whoever was doing this. But I immediately remembered the silhouettes hiding near the sideways sedan and abandoned the idea. It clearly felt like an ambush. And the more I thought about the situation, the worse it became, realizing that the voice on the radio was probably watching everything happen in real time while speaking to me. Then I started noticing something else disturbing. The CB radio kept producing faint interference noises even when nobody was speaking. Like the other person's microphone was still open. Sometimes I could hear breathing. Other times it sounded like an engine or gravel being crushed under tires. My stomach kept getting heavier while I drove alone on that road without cell phone service and practically no traffic. That was when I finally saw real lights on the horizon. A small truck stop near a state highway intersection several miles ahead. I had never felt so relieved seeing an illuminated area in the middle of the night. I kept accelerating toward the truck stop while compulsively checking the mirrors. The vehicle behind me continued following until almost the illuminated entrance. Then it slowed down. The moment I began pulling into the parking lot filled with parked trucks, the lights completely disappeared from the dark road behind me. No headlights appeared after that. No car entered the truck stop. It felt like they had simply given up the second I reached a place with other people around. I parked the truck shaking uncontrollably and sat there several minutes unable to get out of the cab. When I finally climbed down, I noticed something that immediately sent chills through me. There was a long scrape mark running along the side of the trailer near the rear section, as if some metal tool had dragged across the body while I passed the sideways sedan. I told the other truckers at the stop what had happened, and one of them immediately mentioned that criminal groups had used cars, blocking secondary roads in that region to rob truck drivers during the night. To this day, I still don't know who the man on the CB radio was or how he could describe such specific details inside my cab before the vehicle even appeared behind me. But honestly, I believe that if I had stopped on that dark road to help the sideways sedan, I probably never would have made it to that Texas truck stop that night.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.